Chris was reading that scripture, I was thinking, boy, what a fun reading that one is.
I didn't like it.
Yeah. And he called me yesterday, as he often does when he reads a lesson, to find out either how to pronounce a word or what does this mean. And oftentimes I'll tell him what I think it means. And as I say, as a disciple minister, I'm shocked when over 50% of you agree with me with what I say it means. And that's quite all right. That's part of our disciple polity. But he wanted to know what that business about the worm was. And I said, I don't think I'll tell you, Chris. Stay awake in the sermon tomorrow and maybe you'll find out. But what I said, boy, when I say, what a fun reading that is. The words of Jesus, if the hand offends thee, cut it off. When the eye offends thee, pluck it out. Boy, these are harsh words indeed. I thought about, you remember when Jimmy Carter was running for president and he says, in my heart I have lusted? Pull it out, Jimmy. Pull out that heart. It may offend you. Come on, Jesus. Where is all of that compassion that we give you credit for having? Cut it off. Pluck it out. Boy, I can tell you one thing. I'm not sure I want to follow you if that's the price of this thing called Christianity. You see, I think Jesus is really trying to give another message. I think he's, maybe I could describe it by telling a story. A story of three men. They were applying for the job to chauffeur a rich man. And the rich man asked all three of them the same question. He said, suppose you were driving me on a road that was narrow and winding, and it was to the edge of a cliff, a very high cliff indeed. How close to the edge of that cliff could you come when you're driving me and keep me safe? Well, the first driver said, I could easily drive within 6 inches of the edge of that cliff and no problem at all. The second applicant said, well, I think I could drive very confidently within a foot of the edge of that cliff and you wouldn't have any worries. And the third applicant said, I wouldn't even go near the edge of that cliff. I'd stay at least 6 feet away from the edge of that cliff. Well, it was the third man that the rich man hired and gave the job to. I wouldn't go close to the edge of that cliff. Well, you see, I think that's what Jesus is telling his disciples. Don't even get close to the edge of the cliff. Don't get close to sin. Don't get close to that stuff that blocks you from the sunlight of the Spirit. Don't get close to those things that cause you to miss the mark and not do what you're supposed to do. If you're tempted in any way, don't let your guard down. Do whatever is necessary to escape that temptation. When we're talking about sin, I am really talking about not doing those things that block me from the sunlight of the Spirit. I'm talking about those things that bring the sunlight of the Spirit to me, to not keeping that from happening. I'm not talking about sin, 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 the way some of the evangelist preachers and the fundamentalists, and particularly some of the TV personalities, talk about sin, and they always like to add a little bit of a guilt trip along with it. That's not what I'm talking about. Soren Kierkegaard, who was a noted theologian, said that most people believe that the commandments, such as love one's neighbor, are intentionally a little too severe. And this may be one of those that's intentionally a little too severe. They say they were written because it's kind of like setting a clock a half hour ahead of time so that you won't be late in the morning. And that maybe that's the purpose of some of these hard to understand scriptures, to set up a warning. But my friends, if you really look at the words of Jesus, and if we think about them, we may discover their real meaning. I think Jesus really meant exactly what he said, but we don't always interpret that exactly the same way. I think he was saying, don't get into the presence of sin, however you want to define that word. Don't let sin sow its seed in your heart. What he was saying to us, first of all, is that sin is destructive. And what makes sin is that sin is something that destroys people. It is that over againstness in God's wonderful creation that would take God's wonderful creation from the inside and destroy it. If you put yourself in the presence of sin long enough, you will destroy yourself physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. It is those things that cause our problems in life that we're talking about: overeating, gluttony, giving in to our baser human characteristics, being untruthful, thinking bad thoughts, judging others. You can come up with a lot of them. But the hard truth of life is, if we put ourselves into thinking and being around those things, they may become what we are. And we can prove it in a really practical way. Those of you who jog, not too many of us here this morning that do that, or are physically active, and you find that as a result of bad weather or sickness, you're trapped in the house for a few days. After you've been used to exercising, you'll notice that you really crave that exercise. And you may feel miserable until you get back and are able to exercise again. But think about those who sit around a lot. Is it not true that as you sit around a lot, you begin to crave sitting around even more? We begin to crave leisure, total leisure. And as we do, we can watch our bodies absolutely self-destruct. But it seems the less that we do, the more we feel like doing nothing. That's the nature of sin. The more we are exposed to it, the more we do it, the more easy it is, and the more natural it is for us. So Jesus is saying, stay away from it. He's not saying cut off your arm and pluck out your eye. He's saying stay away from it. Don't get in the presence of it. It's kind of the same for depressed people. They feel like doing nothing, and the more they sit around doing nothing, the more depressed they become. The more we nourish destructive habits, the more powerful they become as a force in our lives. And the ironic thing about sinful things is that oftentimes they make things look so wonderful and so attractive, but in the final analysis they don't really lead to a lot of permanent happiness. We moderns, I guess, think we have invented sexual immorality. But if we read the Bible, we find that others, long before us, knew quite a lot about that activity. And the Bible gives us some very clear examples of lust between both men and women. But at the opposite edge of that spectrum, the Bible teaches us about satisfying relationships. And it says satisfying relationships between two people are relationships that have the blessings of God. What we call in religion as sin, I refer to anything that blocks me from the sunlight of the Spirit, because my thoughts, my actions, and my deeds need to be directed towards that Spirit in my daily life. If I do what I call the next right thing, all of the time I continue to do that next right thing, I don't have to worry about the word sin. It has no meaning in my life. To show how little sins or bad habits, if you want, can lead to greater problems, I can tell you about an old Arab legend in which the devil presented himself to a man. And the devil tells the man, "You're about to die, and I can save you from death in one of three different ways." And this is how. You can kill your servant, you can beat your wife, or you can drink this wine. And the man looks at him and he thinks a little bit, and he says, "Well, let me think. To kill my faithful servant is impossible. To mistreat my wife is nothing short of being ridiculous. So I will drink the wine." So saying, he drank the wine. And being drunk, he beat his wife, and he killed his servant who was trying to protect his wife. So the first thing that Jesus is saying to us is that there is a destructiveness within human life, within all of us, and we need to watch out for that destructive side that we have, and we need to stay away from it. And that's the first thing I think Jesus meant when he said, if your eye offended you, pluck it out. There is another thing to be said, however. That is that our bad thoughts and our bad actions, our bad habits, may be a reflection of an inner poverty of our lives, where we have not allowed that light of the Spirit to enter into our lives. An evangelist, preacher of years ago, E. Stanley Jones, described modern man like this: if he's in a tight spot financially, he borrows money on the furniture. If he's feeling low, he lights a cigarette. If he's lonely, he goes to a movie. If he's maladjusted, he goes to a psychiatrist. If he has a headache, he takes an aspirin. All of these things are from the outside in. The Christian remedy is from the inside out. You see, we don't have to be enslaved by bad thoughts, actions, habits, call it sin if you like. We can overcome. We can be positive, health-filled people living lives of satisfaction. All of us, always. There's a story that some of you may have heard about a drunk who was lying on a barroom floor, and he began to come out of his drunken stupor, and some joker in the room saw that he was beginning to wake up, and so he put a little smidge of Limburger cheese on the top of his lip. Soon the drunk got up, and it really smelled bad. He went out of the building. He came back again. He went out of the building again, and he wobbled back in, finally shaking his head in disgust, and he shouted, "It's no use. The whole world stinks." You see, it wasn't the whole world that was stinking. It was just that little Limburger cheese under his nose. See, there are two ways of approaching life. The first one is to say, there is no hope. That was the message of the existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre. In his famous phrase, "There's no exit, there is only death and decay." And in that environment, sin becomes a way of simply passing the hours. Doesn't make any difference. There is no exit. But there's another way of looking at life, and that's the way Jesus Christ looked at life. And that is to say, to look at the world as God's creation, and even look at the grave in a positive manner. Look at the grave as not an end to life, but a door that opens to eternal life. One attitude towards life looks at sin simply as a human response to temptation. But the other looks at it as a hindrance to the plan and providence and purposefulness of God, as it blocks you from the sunlight of the Spirit. If we keep busy and we keep our mind occupied with positive and productive things and service to God and service to others, we have little time to fantasize or to participate in the things that block us from the sunlight of the Spirit, or to think, if you care to, sinful thoughts. We have to decide what kind of a life it is that we want to live. If you want a healthy body, you can't pollute it. I would really love to have a healthy body, but like in so many other things, I have to admit, I am not willing to pay the price to get it. That's what Jesus is saying to you and to me this morning. Be willing to pay the price to follow me. If you want to have a healthy spirit, you have to focus on the source of the power for that healthy spirit. Albert Einstein was once quoted saying, "Try not to become a person of success, but rather become a person of value." We have to set a goal in order to achieve that, and that is another more simple explanation or meaning of that word sin: to miss the mark. When we do not become people of value, we have missed the mark that God set for us. Viktor Frankl, out of his experience in the Nazi concentration camp, wrote a great book, and it's called Man's Searching for Meaning. In it, he wrote a paragraph in which he said, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms. That is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." In these times, in which there are so many opportunities to stray from the straight and narrow, there will be those people who are men and women of value, who will recognize the destructiveness of bad actions and human thoughts and in their lives, and who will know that the way to a good life is to fix their eyes upon God, who has created us, and become that beautiful creation that God intended for us to be. I hope that you and I can all become that person of value. Amen.